Hi there. So I just wanted to preface this video with basically the reason why I'm making it. So a big reason why I'm making it, I know there's lots of JavaScript tutorials out there. I helped teach the graphics class at Macewan University last year, and so this is actually for that class. So if you're going into WebGL, I was just going to go over some of the basics of JavaScript and using it in that kind of context, and hopefully this video will be beneficial. I did something in person last year, but clearly because of COVID and everything, I've chosen to do a video this time. So leave any questions you have. I'm not an expert in JavaScript. I do it for work, and I've done many projects with it, but by no means do I know all the answers to every question in relation to JavaScript. So yeah, let's get started. Alright, so to get started, you can see I use Visual Studio Code. It's my favorite editor for most of programming. Yeah, it's up to you. You can use things like Sublime or whatever. The first thing we'll do is we'll create a main.js file. And then what we'll do is we'll create an index.html file. And here we can start coming up with really basic HTML stuff, and we can just see whether or not this works. So if we then open this up, we can go like this, and we can see on our screen that we have a tag here that says hey there. So not the greatest HTML in the world, but for now it'll do. And what we're going to do is inside of this, we're going to bring in a script, and we're going to bring in a, I believe we go text JavaScript. It's been a while since I've actually done this, so, and I think we go like this and like that. So then we can just refresh our page, and we can open up the console. So this is Chrome if you're using Firefox, stuff like that. It's pretty similar. But what we'll do now is over here, maybe we'll go in our main.js, let's just console log the word hey. So with any luck, we'll see that in the console. There we go. So now what we've done is in our HTML file, we've created a link to this script. And so for people who are coming into Computer Science 370, so graphics from a Python background, it's very similar to Python, where if you write, a function, if we were to write some function, but then we never called that function, it wouldn't run. So it's very similar in that way, that the things that get called will run as soon as they're called. So what we'll do, that was just showing you really quickly how we can make an HTML file and link JavaScript to it. What we'll do next is we will go over the basics of variables in JavaScript and play around with them a little bit. So one thing that a lot of people probably see is they'll see something like var. If we're used to Python, we can go x is equal to some string or something like that. In our case, this won't really, like in JavaScript, what we need to do is we can use the word var like this, and then we can console.log. And console.log is basically, if I didn't say earlier, is the equivalent of printing to standard out in Python. So you can see that when we console log this out, we get the value. So there's a bit of a difference. You might have seen something like this, let y something y. You may have seen something like this before, let and var. If not, that's totally okay. Both are valid syntax in JavaScript. The difference is the scope. So var is not the same as necessarily a global variable. I don't know if I would call it a global variable, but it can be used in a very global sense, meaning that if we were to declare something var, we can access it in functions below it and things like that, no problem. Let, on the other hand, is usually limited to local scopes and things like that. The other type of variable that we can use in JavaScript is called const. So const is, well, I'm sure you can guess, stands for a constant, meaning that this value shouldn't change This is more, we can use strict rules. You can use things like TypeScript and things like that to enforce the actual like strictness of this constant. Or we can, in my case with JavaScript, I generally just try to use const when I know something isn't going to change. So if we try and reassign it, we can see that we can't reassign that variable because we've declared it as a constant. So it doesn't make any sense to try and reassign it. Okay, so those are our three variable types. And in JavaScript, it's what we would call loosely or dynamically typed, meaning that we don't need to go int x is equal to 5, like we would in C or C# or something like that. If we want x equal to 5, then we can take a look and we can see that it's changed its type. In JavaScript, one of the things you can do to check types is we can go type of. And you can see that to JavaScript, there's no such thing as an int. There's no such thing as those specific values. If we were to say change this to a float, you can see that it's the same. It's just a number. And that's all that JavaScript is interested in. Is this a number, or is it a string, or is it an array, something like that. So let's go ahead and actually try out a Boolean and see what it does with that. As you can see, exactly what we would expect. Boolean. And then let's finally create an array of things. And let's see what it calls that. So in this case, it'll call it an object. Now if we create typically what we would call an object, we would see object. So JavaScript's a little bit tricky that way. You never want to make too many assumptions about what a value is or isn't, simply because we can reassign it on the fly, which is great in some ways, but dangerous in other ways, as I'm sure you can expect or understand why. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was arrays and what we can do with arrays and how we can handle arrays. So if we wanted, for example, to print out all the values in X, we could do something like this. Let's get rid of this and this and this and this. Now we'll just focus on X. So if we wanted to print the entire array, we can, and that's great. But let's say we want to add a number. Let's concatenate the index. So this would be like array 0 of 1 and things 2 because it's at index 0, 1, 2. So similar to what we're used to in other programming languages, we can make for loops. So we could say that I is less than x dot length, I plus plus. And in here, before we do our concatenation thing, let's just try and go like this and see if we get what we would expect. As you can see, that's exactly what we would expect. So JavaScript is a little bit cool where we can go like this and we can say x, and let's just add I to it. And what happens when we add a integer or a number, according to JavaScript, to a string? Well, we can take a look. It just concatenates it for us really nicely. So that's one example of how we can do things in a for loop. We could also use a for each loop, so we could go x dot for each, and inside of that, we would then have, we could call it value, and let's console.log the value, and we'll comment this out really quick. Okay, so now we'll see that it does the exact same thing, and if we want to, we could also still go like this, and I believe index is the second value in that. There we go. So we can see that this and this are actually equivalent. It's totally up to you what you want to do with it. There's reasons for using one or the other. It's just what you're comfortable with. Don't worry about this arrow notation too much. You might have seen things like this instead. You might have seen things like that, and that does the exact same thing. The arrow notation and the function notation we'll get to. We'll talk about functions later in the video, but for now just understand that on each of these values we want to call a function, and that function is going to do something. So in this case we're going to add the index to it and we're going to console log it. Cool. So next up, we'll talk about objects and how to use objects in loops and different ways that we can do different things with them. Because one of the reoccurring themes that you'll see in your graphics class is usually arrays of objects. So it's important for us to understand how these objects work and what we can do with them. So first and foremost, this is syntax on how we can generate an object. We can also just create an object. We could go game object 2 is equal to, and we could just give it an empty thing and say that game object 2 dot name is equal to new object, so on and so forth. So then if we were to console log game object 1, and console log game object 2, we can take a look and see that right here is exactly as we would expect. They're both, in our eyes, game objects, but this one has more fields than this one, and that's simply because we just didn't declare it the exact same. We could go ahead and say, you know, its position, its type, if we wanted to, and then we would have equivalent objects. But the important part is understanding that if we want to access specific fields, we can do so, and we can print out, okay, just the position, or just the type, or just the name. And if they're nested objects, so let's go ahead and make a nested object, and we can declare another object in here and say nested name. So would be I am nested. So if we want to print out this nested object's nested name, we would say that game object dot nested name, and you can see the value. So this is really important when we get into stuff like, let's say we're going through an array of objects, and some of those objects have children, like in our scene hierarchy, and we need to access those children. You can go as nested as you want. You can go all the way down. It's just important to know that we can access these values by using the keys, not the values, but the keys. And another really cool thing that we can check out, if you're ever not sure about what keys are contained in an object, you can always go like this, and you can always take a look at each key. So we can see, let's pull this down. You can see that name is a key, position is a key, type is a key, and nested is a key. It won't show us that nested key because that key, nested name, is a key that belongs to this object. So really quickly, let's see what happens if we try and console log game object dot rotation. You and I both know that rotation doesn't exist in here. And in any other programming language, it would probably scream at you and not let you do what we're about to do. But as you can see, we get undefined. So undefined in JavaScript is a little bit different than what we're used to. Python would probably throw an error and say, hey, you know, this doesn't exist. You're like a key error, right? In this case, JavaScript is going to compile fine, and we're not going to get any errors. But if we were to try and do something with that object later on, it could really mess us up. So we can do little checks, and we can say that if GameObject.rotation, then we're going to console log I am defined. Whoops. Like this. And you can see that this doesn't print because right now it's not defined. Let's throw in a quick rotation. Even though that doesn't make any sense for a rotation value, we can see that when we add that key, we see that it is defined. But what happens if we declare it as null? Well, this if statement will check for both undefined and null values, as well as, weirdly enough, values of 0. So it's a Boolean expression. If anybody's taken computer science, I'm sure most of you know that in Computer Science 101 we talk about things like you know, checking if x is, you know, if just plain old if x. Well, if x is equal to 0, that'll be false. If x is anything other than 0, 1, or let's try -1 in our case, we can prove whether or not. So we can see that -1, anything other than 0 in the number range works just fine. Let's declare it as an empty string. Empty strings apparently do not get evaluated by this if statement. So you need to be really careful about what values or how you're checking your values. If you're fine with this being null at first, and you just want to check if this is undefined, then we can go like this and say, if this isn't undefined, okay, that's fine. But we need to be really specific. So we can also check specifically for null. We can declare this as undefined if we want to. So just don't confuse the two. Don't make any assumptions. Just understand that undefined is not equal to null, and null is not equal to undefined. If we use an if statement without specifying which, it's going to check for both of those, as well as 0, empty strings, things like that. I'm just going to take a drink real quick. Alright, so let's get on to an actual use case. Let's get rid of rotation, and let's create an array of game objects. And inside this game object, I'm just going to show you how we could declare a bunch of objects. And we'll just copy and paste this, and I'll just format it, and we will copy and paste this again, and again, and again. Okay, and we'll just call this 2, 2, 2, oh, that's a 3. 3, 3, 3. I'm going to go 3, 3. Oh, what am I doing? Sorry, I apologize. I am clearly not in the game today. 3 is fine. That's fine. That's fine. Sorry about that. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, so now we have this array of game objects. And what we're going to do is we're going to iterate over them, and we're going to call a function on them. Well, actually, for now, we're going to iterate over them, and maybe we'll change a value, maybe we'll add a value, something like that. So if you remember from before with arrays, and we'll get rid of game object because we don't need it anymore. We have a whole bunch of game objects. If you remember from arrays before, we said that we can iterate over arrays. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go game objects dot for each, and we'll say that this is going to be our object inside of here. Again, don't worry about this arrow notation. It's the exact same as if we did this. Exact same. There's zero difference between them. Okay, other than just stylistically, I like the other one. But we'll do it this way for now, since I think this is probably what most people have seen. Okay, and inside of here, let's just console log each object to make sure that we get what we expect. So we see that we get sphere, sphere 1, sphere 2, sphere 3. Okay, awesome. And then inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to add a field and we will delete a field. So let's say that object.rotation is equal to, we'll make it a string, which again, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but we'll say new rotation. Generally rotations we'd use a matrix or something like that. And we can see here that we should console log after the change. So we can see that each of them now gets this value of rotation. Well, let's do something else now. Let's say that we actually don't want nested in there because, well, Zach was just showing us this thing. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's kind of dumb, as Zach usually does. So let's delete object.nested. And as you can see, we've removed that key altogether from that value. So this is really powerful because when you start writing WebGL, you're generally going to use a for loop or a for each loop like this, or more likely a while loop, because we're just going to keep iterating over and over again. And you're going to go through each of your game objects, and you're going to most likely call your render function, whoops, which doesn't exist in this context, but whoops, we'd call like our render on our object, right? Something like that. This is a really common use case for our game or our scene or whatever it is that we want to do. So it's important to understand that inside of here, this object are each of these, and so if we want to get nested, we can go object.nested.nested name, and if we went further nested, and I'm just doing this to make it like super ugly so that people understand just how gross you can get. Further nested value hiya. So our brain is looking at this like, holy man, like how many levels are this? And hopefully we don't need to go this nested, but you'd be surprised by some of the JSON that you see. And JSON relates to this structure, this JavaScript object notation is what JSON stands for. But you'd be surprised at how much of it looks like this. So now what we can say is down here, not all of them have this, just this one has it. So let's do an if statement. We'll say that if, and we use we'll go nested, and just go dot and take another look. Okay, we'll go further nested. Okay, what's after that? Further nested, and what's after that? And if you have a nice IDE like Visual Studio Code, you can see that it was coaching me along the way. This is the next value. This is the next value. This is the next value. Then let's console.log, and we'll select this and go like that. So now if we go like this, whoops, we can see that we get this error saying, hey, this doesn't exist. Because this doesn't exist for all of them, which is totally fine. So what we can do, we can say that object.nested.further nested and that. So we can see that by doing this, we know that every single one of them is going to have nested, but we're not sure that every single one of them is going to have further nested. So by checking this first key, we're not making assumptions that, hey, this first key exists and this second key exists, so check the third key. By checking this first, we don't make that assumption, and so we if it fails, this first Boolean logic thing fails, and we just continue down. But if this passes, then we're able to check this safely. We should probably also check whether this on its own exists without the value, but that's, you get what I'm saying. Okay, so that's objects. I want to quickly touch on functions and then quickly go over some HTML manipulation stuff, and then we're pretty much done. So the first thing I wanted to do was just write a function. We'll call it main, and we'll console.log I'm in main. Okay, so you can see we get no output. So this is similar to what I was talking about with Python, where Python, if we don't call our function, if we just declare it, it's not going to get called. But since we called it, we know that it exists now, and that's great. That's what we want. So what we can do now is we can create another function called inner function, and it'll take a parameter of word, and we will console.log the word. Okay, so get rid of this, and this is going to call inner function of hello world. I know, the classic. So you can see that this is, in JavaScript, we can declare this function below it, above it, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the function can see it, and we can call it, and that's really all it comes down to. Quickly, I just want to show you another version of how some people write functions, and this way it doesn't confuse you. So you'll see things like this, another function, and it will take a word and a I don't know why I'm hesitating so bad. A word and a name, and then we'll console.log the word and the name. So this is also valid syntax for declaring a function. Again, we see that arrow notation that I had kind of talked about. It's really similar. So we'll do this, and we'll say that the word will also be our goodbye, and then this is really morbid, but goodbye world. So if we say hello world and goodbye world, you can see that we called our first function, called our second function, and away we go. Okay, so to kind of talk about linking our JavaScript now to interact with stuff in our HTML, you'll see I kind of updated our HTML a little bit. I created a body and a div with a header. So if we take a look, you can see here, this is what we're looking at. I had a button, but I'll add that button back because we're going to interact with it here in JavaScript. So what we'll do, whoops, I don't want full screen. What we'll do is we'll say that window on load is going to be equal to a function. Again, we're just using that arrow notation, or we could write it like a function if we wanted to. And we'll just say that window has successfully loaded. So if we take a look, we can see here that it's popping up exactly as we would expect. Well, some of the cool things that we can do here is we could create a button, whoops, we could say click me. And what we'll do is we'll give it an ID of my button. Now over here, we can use something like this, document.getElementById, and we'll pass in the string, which we declared right there, my button, and then we will console.log out, just to make sure that we have my button. So let's take a look, and we have it right there. As we hover over it, you can actually see that it's there. It doesn't do anything when we click it, but cool. Okay, so now we could actually go like this, and just close this real quick. Alright, what we could say is my button.addEventListener, and we'll say that we're looking for click, and we'll say that this will have an event, and it'll look like that. Again, don't worry too much about what's going on. We're gonna listen for a click event. I don't know if that's the right syntax. We might have to Google it, but anyways, we'll find out. There's gonna be an event that happens. And we'll just take a look at what that event is. So if we refresh, there we go. So you can see that in this event, there's a whole bunch of information. There's like, let's take a look. Was there any movement in the X and Y on the mouse? What's the timestamp? What was the target? So on and so forth. But what this allows us to do is that we can actually say, when this happens, do something kind of cool. So maybe what we'll do over here is below this, let's create that's fine. Let's create a paragraph thing, and we'll say we'll put 0. Or you know what? We'll count is 0. So we can see right here that count is 0. Over here, before all this, let's create a variable, count, and we'll set it to 0. And when this clicks, let's go ahead and say my counter is equal to, and we'll go with this, 0. So ID is equal to counter value. Alright. This is a little ugly, but I think you can kind of understand what I'm doing. I'm putting a paragraph inside of another paragraph. So if we refresh, it's on the next page, which that's not great. I am really not great at HTML, to be honest with you. Maybe a span. Let's try span. Hey, there we go. Okay, cool. And we'll actually get rid of the 0 because we're going to initialize that when this starts. And we gave it an ID of counter value, so we'll say that let my counter document, same thing. So we're going to get that right there, and we're going to say that my counter dot say inner HTML, I think, is equal to our variable up here, count. Let's just see if this is going to work. All right, perfect. So you can see that we didn't actually hard code 0 anywhere in our HTML, but here we did. We said this is going to be 0, so on and so forth. Now what we can do is when this clicks, we will increment our count. So what's going to happen? Well, nothing's going to happen here, but we can see that we are, I think, if let's get rid of this and let's console.log count. We can see it is incrementing, but the question is, well, why isn't it incrementing here? Well, we need to make that update ourselves. So we could say that my counter.innerHTML is equal to count. So now you can see that as we increment, the number will change for us. And that's exactly what we would want it to do. So this is just a really quick example. There's tons of documentation on, once I have an element, how do I delete an element, how do I update an element, how do I insert another element, things like that. There's tons and tons of documentation on all of that. We can add event listeners to all sorts of, all types of things. We could say, I want to say mouse over is one. Let's just take a look. There's so many mouse over. So this is just if the person moves their mouse over the value, we could be like console.log our event. So you can see that every time I'm not even clicking, but we can listen for that hover. So if we wanted to, we could do things based off of hovering. We can do things based off of all sorts of different listeners. And again, these are all Googleable. You can look at them. You can do whatever you want with them. But I just wanted to show you how to interact with HTML. Now, to close the video, the last thing I wanted to talk about is debugging and how we can debug and strategies to it. If you're lazy, you'll do something like what I do a lot, where you console log count. So let's say we're not sure what count is doing. Well, we can see it in our development tools console. One of the things you should be aware of is that we can do things like this. Console.warm. So you can see that this is yellow. And then lastly, we can do console.error, and that's red. So if we want to warn ourselves of something or we want to error, that's one way of doing it. Another really, really, really handy thing that I highly suggest you take a look at is actually opening up the sources tab, opening up our main.js, and using breakpoints. So now you can see that this will be paused when we hit this point. And we can actually hover over count and see what the value is. And if we want to resume, then we can resume. So this is really handy if we're not sure what's going on, and then we hit it. Well, we can see that this time it's going to be 6. Okay, feel free and go ahead. And we want to remove that breakpoint, you can remove it. So breakpoints, I would say, are the best way of debugging your JavaScript program. They're not the only way, but they definitely are the best. There's tons and tons of memes about it, but I would highly suggest using breakpoints. So this was just an intro into JavaScript and HTML in relation to things that you're going to need to know for your WebGL project. And we'll get more into WebGL and how to use that in a future video. If you have any questions or comments, again, I am not by any means a professional. Well, I guess technically I am because I do it for work, but I don't do front-end development for work. This is just something that, as far as graphics are concerned, I did as a hobby and as part of teaching the graphics class. So leave any comments you have or questions or anything like that, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.